Recording in progress.
Well, thank you again for attending today. I know it's right after the lunch hour and everybody's probably feeling like they're getting settled back into work. And we'll have this as our intellectual dessert today. I will hand it over to Doug Miller, the site administrator at Pennsbury. And if all of our speakers would like to introduce themselves, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Doug.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Today, we'll talk about what to me was probably one of the most meaningful pieces of my career, which was to work with the descendant communities of the Lenape, the federally recognized descendant communities, 2 Canadian, 3 from the US, a series of museum professionals to help bring the repatriated remains of their ancestors and their funerary objects home to land here that was part of their original homeland, Lenape-Hoken. I want to thank Janet Johnson, Curator of Archaeology for the State Museum of Pennsylvania, for her participation today, and in particular, Jeremy Johnson, who's the Director of Education for the Delaware Tribe of Indians. With that is sort of the groundwork. I'm going to ask my colleague Janet to talk a little bit about the Native American Graves Repatriation Act first, and what that is and what it means to museums and collecting organizations. So Janet, if I can pass the ball your way.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you again, Jeremy, for joining us in this discussion and presentation, and PA Museums for bringing this to the public. I think this is important information. The acronym NAGPRA is what typically folks will hear applied when we're talking about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And the law was signed in 1990, which requires that museums and institutions report their remains that they may hold in their institution and the associated funerary objects, as well as any ceremonial objects that might be held that can be associated with tribes across the US. And the process of doing this is through an inventory of those collections held within museums. And then those inventories are reported to the National Park Service, specifically to the Department of the Interior. The Department of the Interior is the agency who implements the NAGPRA regulations. And they are who we work with in helping us to keep current with changes in those laws and updates that have occurred since that was passed in 1990. We also have a big portion of this is consultation and working with the tribes in identifying what they consider culturally significant and ceremonial objects. Sometimes archaeologists don't always understand and recognize those items as sacred to the tribes. And so it's an opportunity for us to learn from those tribal members about those objects and to learn more about the cultural significance of these objects. And again, for museums, we have gone through this process. It's been 30 years since the NAGPRA regulations were passed, and the beginning of the reporting process. And I can say that every time that we've had the opportunity to have consultation with specifically, especially the Delaware, who we have had the most consultation with, it has been enlightening and enriching for everyone that has participated in that process. I had shared with Jeremy once before that Linda Pula, who was the historic preservation officer when I first began consultation with the Delaware. What was my inspiration, if you will. She really guided me in understanding how significant it was to work with these federally recognized tribes and the sacrifices that they have had to make over time. And it's been rewarding. So I hope that everybody has a good sense of this. We continue to work with the Delaware on the repatriation process. And there will be, again, additional consultation and repatriations of additional remains that are held here at the State Museum. Jeremy?
Hey, Kudomasi Hamohach, Delawense, Lepoyokum Katatum, Jeremy Johnson, Nila Nape, Shoanu Akpeoli, Nile Lindum Ele Paekwa. Hello, how are you all? My name is Jeremy Johnson. I am Lenape, and I'm glad that you all are here. I was just gonna echo some of the things that were just said, that it is important for us that we have the consultations with museums about our ancestors and our funerary objects. A lot of times we'll be given inventories from museums, and sometimes the funerary objects have been not really included within the articles for repatriation. And when we see some of the other collections, we begin to notice that there are things that should be associated there. One of the most important things, I believe, in our interactions and consultations is building that relationship with the individuals at the museums. We, as my tribe, the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, we have a healthy distrust about institutions in general. Just because archaeological museum, anthropological institutions, and it's just historical fact and the historical trauma that is associated with that. A lot of our elders will not really associate themselves with governmental agencies or even institutions. And so it can be difficult on our end, but building that community and relationship really helps. We are willing to do those types of things as a part of our jobs. And so it's just one of those hurdles that we understand. And we understand also that a lot of times there's a misunderstanding that we aren't trying to work with folks. We move fairly slowly whenever you consider our structures. Just as a background, the federally recognized communities in the United States consist of the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, the Delaware Nation in Anadarko, Oklahoma, the Stockbridge Muncie Band of Mohican Indians in Stockbridge, Wisconsin, and that's within the United States. There are also two First Nations, the Moravian town Lenape and the Muncie town, or the Muncie Delaware Nation in Ontario, Canada. But understanding that we are also working with each other within our history of removals, the Delaware tribe, we have had 8 forced removals from Lenapehoking, and as have the Delaware Nation. And so the Stockbridge, Muncie, and our Canadian relatives are very close to that as well. They ended up moving up north a lot sooner than we were able to stop moving west. And so they were able to settle with our Oneida kind of allies at that point. So what you need to understand, I think sometimes when we're talking about going through the NAGRA process and the repatriation processes, is that we're also having to consult within our 5 communities as well. And each community has its own different structure. Each federally recognized tribe has its own tribal structure. So we're having to communicate with each other. And if you are unfamiliar with tribal government, sometimes they're difficult to work within. We're working within a structure that is still not what we would say culturally based. You know, we're working within governmental structures that are kind of forced upon us in that way too. So it's not natural sometimes to have to work within those structures whenever you have board meetings instead of being able to gather as a community and make decisions. So those things are the things we're dealing with. Some of the things that we need to be aware of, and we try and we talk about our consultations, are kind of some dead periods when it comes to cultural practices, responsibilities and things. So those are just some of the kind of giving you an idea when it gets to working with tribes, that it's not going to be a quick process. I mean, that I believe that the repatriation efforts for the collection from Abbott Farm had started as early as 2006, I believe, somewhere in there. It started, I know it was extremely early. I came on later. However, I know that the process has started a while back, almost 20 years, 15 to 20 years ago. And so, and we finally managed to make that happen. However, I really just kind of wanted to mention that what it means to us to actually be doing these things. And it's kind of hard to encapsulate in a very short amount of time. My responsibilities at a certain time were to take, after all the NAGPRA process had been completed for the most part, and we finally got the inventories and the delivery dates for these items, we had to find a place to reinter them. And that's another struggle we have as tribal entities, because we are landless when it comes to Lenape hawking. We have no real lands in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Delaware. And so we try to reinter our ancestors within about a 60-mile radius of where they were disinterred. And the thinking behind that is that would be about a 3-day, fairly quick walk for our ancestors, and they would be familiar with those areas. We could definitely take our ancestral remains and reinter them in Oklahoma, but they've never been to Oklahoma, so it doesn't make sense to us. Plus, you'd be separating, considering that the age, a lot of times you're coming up with partial remains, and we're trying our best not to separate the remains of our ancestors by that amount of distance because of our cultural beliefs when it comes to the beliefs of the afterlife and those types of things. So my job at the time, after the NAGPRA process and was gone through with the multiple institutions, I believe it was 5 or 6 different museums, some ancestral remains coming from as far away as UC Berkeley to Pennsbury Manor. It was my job then to make sure that we had the proper the preparations done when it came to the actual burial site. Also taking in those thousands of artifacts, funerary objects, and hundreds of ancestral remains and cataloging those and preparing those for burial. I'm not going to get into specifics of that just because of the sensitivity that we place around those practices, but just know that it took us a while. We're talking about treating each individual as an individual, and we're talking about hundreds of individuals and their associated funerary objects. So this process could have taken weeks, honestly, but we completed within 4 days because of our cultural beliefs. And so it was pretty much a nonstop operation from the time we arrived at Pennsbury Manor to the time of our final ceremony of reinterment. We did it in phases. But one thing I want to say whenever that really matters to us is how our ancestors and funerary objects are shipped to us, the manner in which they are returned. A lot of folks did a really good job. And then there were some that were they were okay, but it was a little bit iffy, whenever we had multiple ancestors in one container and only separated by paper, it became an issue because of some jostling through shipment and things, and trying to discern what remains went with what individual was kind of and it was a little bit disheartening at times, because what do you do whenever they're mixed up in those ways? And so what we try to do is we are very flexible and adaptable when it comes to what we are trying to do, because even our ceremony, when it comes to reinterment, we don't have a process for that. We never thought as people that we would have to rebury our grandfathers and our grandmothers in that way. So we had to adapt and do those things based on our cultural beliefs. But whenever we're in these, I would just say we are very thankful whenever we're heard, when we're in these processes, that we don't request things just unnecessarily. They are often based on cultural or spiritual practices that we are continuing to this day. And so I really do appreciate the fact that those we were involved with listened, and I've been in some consultations where it was very tense, because we could tell that the people weren't listening to what we were trying to say, and saying that these artifacts go with these people, and it can be a little bit adversarial at times because of the nature of collections and some individuals who may not understand our ways. And so, but we've had a really good experience in this process with the institutions we worked with, and especially we would say thank you to Doug, because it was the area provided was outstanding. The support provided by Doug and his staff was more than, it was all we could ask for. We were never in need of really anything. It was, if we asked for something, for the most part, it was provided. And that was very helpful in the process, because this process of once all the return, the process of actually preparing and reinterring the ancestors is very, I still get emotional thinking about it. It's very stressful. It's very hard work, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so having that support on that end was very helpful for us. And so I know I've spoken at quite a length here, but I would be happy to answer more questions about some of what I can answer about that process after Doug has kind of explained his part in the Pennsbury.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you so much. Jean, I want to assure you, this is a part where we're going to talk about what happened at Pennsbury Manor. I've seen some of your texts and so on. For myself, the first conversation that I had about the possibility of a reburial at Pennsbury Manor came courtesy of the chief archaeologist for the state of New Jersey, Greg Latanzi, and he brought a tribal member, Larry Hetty, who was working on repatriation in 2004. Jeremy mentioned that this is a slow, meticulous process. There are 5 tribes. Jeremy also mentioned that they each have their own different political structure and so on. Pennsbury was the first project that all 5 were here and involved in. And Jeremy's role in the process, and I am a huge fan, he was balancing 5 different cultural groups who all come from the same heritage and are all descendants of the Lenape. At Pennsbury, we had that conversation in 2004, and basically it went dead for a decade. During that time, I had had an opportunity to do a discovery grant courtesy of the Pew Charitable Trust. One of my aspirations for Pennsbury Manor was to revisit the legendary Penn and the Indian story, but from the Indians' perspective and their viewpoint. So I had an opportunity to work with the founding director of the Smithsonian Institution for Native Americans, Rick West, was my guide, and my educator and I went to Oklahoma, and we met with Jeremy's tribe, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, which is headquartered in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. We also met with the Delaware Nation, which is in Anadarko, Oklahoma. For a variety of reasons, mostly distance, we were not able to come full circle yet on that aspiration of mine. But along the way, we built relationships. And a piece of advice given to me by Rick West, that Smithsonian director, was build the relationship and everything else will fall into place. And if you enter into it wanting to build a relationship, that will lead to other things. I had no idea that we would end up having a burial ground for the ancestors here at that time. Shortly, a few years after that trip, we started to have more formal conversations about would Pennsbury set aside some land. Obviously, we didn't want to create one archaeological site by destroying another. So there was consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. There was archaeological exploration that was done. We worked with FEMA about areas that are on flood maps, et cetera, because we sit right on the Delaware. And there was a lot of complexity in choosing a location that was acceptable. And Janet mentioned with NAGPRA that there is an inventory maintained by the Department of Interior, the National Park Service. To my knowledge, currently, there's between 110 and 120,000 sets of human remains. And keep in mind, we use the term ancestors. Jeremy said grandmothers and grandfathers. Think of how we would feel if we went to the cemetery where our grandparents or great-grandparents were interred and just found an empty hole. That should give us, hopefully, a little bit of empathy for what the Delaware and all these other nations have endured. And the people who desecrated the graves the most were those of us that were museum professionals or scientists as archaeologists. There was an archaeological hotspot across the river from Pennsbury. It's a series of archaeological sites collectively called the Abbott Farm. And in the 19th century, Abbott, the farmer who was there, started to plow up human remains. So he contacted nearby museums. At that time, they had archaeologists that they would contract with who came in. Some of Jeremy's ancestors came from as far west as California. Some were up in New England, some were in Chicago, at a variety of these collecting institutions. And professionals like Janet work with the tribes to consult, help them identify the remains. And again, to Jeremy's point, you want the ancestors to rest near where they lived so they would know their resting place. Pennsbury was seen as a safe location. We have boots on the ground 7 days a week. We have eyes on the ancestors every day. We do not advertise where the burial ground is. If you would come and ask me, I won't tell you. But we wanted to make sure that when the ancestors were put to rest again, they were at rest. In a Zoom conversation, I asked a simple question, and I saw Jeremy turn off his mic and consult with his chief, Brad Kilscrow. And we went back to the conversation, and later Jeremy and a tribal member came to consult here and look the place over. Joe Brooks was the other tribal member. And Jeremy and I were having a cup of coffee, and there were two things that stand out from our first conversation. First off, Jeremy told me, I hate it when people tell me my history. And as a historian, I filed that away, and I decided I would keep my mouth shut and listen and learn. And Jeremy is a wonderful teacher. Everyone that I interacted with was a wonderful teacher. But to take that opportunity to listen and learn is something that I would encourage everyone to do. And when you reach out, reach out to the federally recognized people. These are the people that are allowed to reclaim their ancestors. They are the descendant communities recognized by our federal government as being the descendants of the Lenape. And the other thing that Jeremy said was that he wasn't quite sure how to answer the question I had asked. And candidly, I didn't remember what I had asked, but he reminded me, he said, "You asked us what we wanted to do." And he said that was really important. And when consulting with the Delaware or any other descendant communities, federally recognized, make sure that's the first question you ask, and ask it frequently. The cultural history of the Lenape that were here is tenfold, 20-fold what the Eurocentric history is here in chronology. And while we think we know it, we don't. And the opportunity to interact with the 5 tribes here was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. What Jeremy balanced here was 5 different groups who had 250 years of unshared history, different political structures, and unshared funerary practices that had become divergent over those 250 years. I watched in real time negotiation about how they would handle the ancestors. At times I got ahead of myself. One day it was drizzling like it is today here, and a truck arrived from a museum attached to an Ivy League school in New England. And I immediately stepped up and wanted to help unload, and Jeremy said, "We got this." At that point, the ancestors needed to be with their descendants and not with me. There were things that were asked for that I wasn't sure about. He said, "I need a lot of firewood." I'm like, "How much do you need?" He said, 1.5 cords, or half a cord, I should say. There was a ceremonial fire that was necessary. Cedar. There were things for ceremonial purposes that I wouldn't have thought of. I needed to get plastic covers for my smoke detectors if we were having smoke in one of my buildings. And I watched Jeremy bring together a workforce of people who had not worked together from different descendant communities, negotiate the practices that they would follow, work at breakneck speed from sunup to sundown. My staff and I provided food. We provided anything we could logistically that we could, but we were only observers in a cultural practice. And out of respect for the descendant communities, I won't go into any great details, but on the final day, part of what we were asked to do was to provide a feast. There is a celebration after a burial. There is a desire to take water and to have a meal together. And it was one of the best experiences of my career to be with everyone who was celebrating that the ancestors were coming home. And I was asked to keep all of the museum nerds, because many of the collecting institutions who repatriated ancestors came and wanted to participate and so on. So we stayed in the visitor center as the Delaware working together buried their ancestors. And we had agreed that it wouldn't be an oddity, it wouldn't be a press show or anything like that. So there were no cameras, there was no press during the interment. And if you, again, put yourself in the position of, it's your grandfather's funeral, do you want Channel 6 there? Do you want a press oddity out of that? After the fact, and part of what we're doing today is to share the story of what happened here. Hopefully for those of you that might know of cultural remains, help them find their way back to the rightful descendant communities, if possible. The work that Janice has spent decades doing the work that Jeremy and the Delaware have done of reconnecting descendant families with their ancestors and the funerary remains. And some of the funerary remains were not affiliated. We didn't know which sets of ancestors they came with. It was amazing to see. On a different project, I am working with a fellow tribal member of Jeremy's. It's an art project, and this artist had previously been on tribal council. And when he was working with me on a sound art installation that will be premiering this year here at Pennsbury, he said, it's going to change you and you're going to feel different. And I brought my museum educator out of retirement to help host the Delaware when they were here. And one evening, as they were laying some of the ancestors to rest, they were singing in their language, and I could smell the cedar from the smudge pots. And we were standing a very respectful distance back. And Mary Ellen turned to me, tears running down her face, and said, those songs haven't been here in 250 years. And that's for me, it was a very emotional time because I was crying with her. And it was a beautiful thing to witness, but a sad comment that we haven't had those songs here for 250 years. The language that Jeremy greeted you with hasn't been here for centuries. His tribe has worked on language reclamation, and I would invite every one of you to visit the website of the Delaware Tribe of Indians because they have a talking dictionary. And a native son of Pennsylvania has spent 50 years of his life on language reclamation, and he was adopted into the tribe. There is this rich culture that is here. There are names here in Bucks County, Playwiki, Neshaminy, Nakamixon, that come from the first people that were here, who were the Lenape. And it has been such a privilege to get to know them, and such a leap of faith on their part to trust us with their ancestors. Keep in mind, we were the ones that desecrated the graves. We were the ones that took the ancestors away in the funerary objects. As professionals, we should be listening, we should be learning, and we should be working with these descendant communities to bring their voices back where they should be heard and where they feel welcome. And, that's part of what I aspire to for Pennsbury and how we've approached it. And a book that I took inspiration from was a series of essays edited by the Pew Charitable Trust. It's called Letting Go, and it's about community-based interpretation. And the Delaware is part of our community. This interment is not for the public, it's private. But the opportunity that we're enjoying right now is one of those opportunities to tell a Delaware story. So with that, Jeremy, would you like to add anything?
I would just like to address some of the questions there. The connection with Pennsbury and William Penn is intrinsically, the Lenape and Penn are intrinsically intertwined. Without, when we talk about William Penn and Pennsbury Manor, as a tribe, we've carried the story of William Penn even to this day. It was taught to me, it was told to me when I was young. My grandparents would tell me about William Penn and how we had a treaty with William Penn and were lived peaceably until his passing in what has become the Pennsylvania colony. Our story, it's kind of hard to encapsulate in such a short amount of time, but whenever you look at our first contact in 1527 with Verrazano in the Hudson Bay to the time of us residing within Eastern Pennsylvania, pretty much our entire groups of people, when we're talking about all of our Muncie relatives from New York and Manhattan Island being moved out by the Dutch and the Swedish and the English to those areas that we're talking about in Eastern Pennsylvania, we do think of William Penn as a friend. We don't think so fondly about his sons. When you talk about 1737 and the walking purchase and one of the largest land swindles in one day, 1,500 square miles of Lenape lands. So being tied, the tie there to Pennsbury, to me, is the fact of that we have this duality of thought about Penn and his ancestors, that we do hold him in high regard, and that we also do not hold his sons and his other relatives in such high regard because of their actions. However, one of the main connections here, I believe, is that it's almost impossible to think that we would have come back to William Penn's basic, his American homestead to reinter our ancestors from across the river. And that is the connection there that we're trying to reach out and trying to educate, and also to heal from the process of the things that have occurred to us. And we're open to that. And it's been very helpful that other people are willing to reach out. And the fact that it was Pennsbury Manor and that William Penn played a large part in that period of our existence is something that was, I think a lot of times it was meaningful to us in a certain way, but I understand for the community, it was more meaningful, the current community, that we are returning. And that we were willing to basically return. And so those are the kind of connections we're talking about when we're talking about connections to Pennsbury. We're talking about a long shared history. We're talking about working together now to highlight that history. Because if you're talking about colonial history in the United States, you're talking about 400 years of colonial history, and yet you're talking about 20,000 years of existence in Lenape before. And we've been lost in that narrative. Our voices had been lost in that narrative. And this is one of the first times that we've been able to tell our stories in our own ways, and been encouraged to do so, because we've had historians and archaeologists and anthropologists tell our stories over and over and over and over for us and interpreted by other non-native historians and anthropologists and archaeologists. And so it's a huge thing to be even, I would say, us haven't even considered the area of because of the history with being pushed from our areas and hunted, basically killed, removed forcibly. When you're talking, I see the chats again.
If I can jump in, Jeremy, and
yes, please.
Your questions in the chat. You're talking human remains that span a millennia or more. They're not clearly defined as one group. They are not identified as individuals. When they were interred, there were not headstones that identify who they were. So we don't know if any of them knew William Penn or not. Some do come from the contact period. Might they have been in a group that came to Pennsbury? Certainly, that's a possibility, but we have no documentation to that. The lion's share of these remains come from that archaeological site across the river from Pennsbury. There are some that were nearer to Pennsbury. None physically come from the footprint of the historic site of Pennsbury Manor currently. There were people who lived in the neighborhood and who certainly predated Penn at that time. The connection for Pennsbury, and I think for the Delaware, was that Penn and the Lenape connection historically. And for me, as the director of the site, it was coming full circle. The land originally came from the Lenape to Penn. There was a land purchase that was negotiated at the Greystones by Penn's cousin, the Greystones in Morrisville, just north of us. It was one of the first land purchases in Penn's name. It was primarily for trade goods. It moved from the Morrisville area west to Playwicky Farm. Playwicky Farm is a public park today. It was historically a Lenape village. Then it went down to the Neshaminy Creek, and where the Neshaminy Creek enters into the Delaware River. That was land that was purchased in Penn's name by his advance man, Captain William Markham, from Jeremy's ancestors. But in a way, having them bring the ancestors back here was coming full circle. And we are very receptive to having the Delaware share their story here, because the Pennsylvania story would not have turned out the way it did. The William Penn story would not have turned out the way it did without the right group of indigenous people welcoming and helping Penn along the way. I would love to be able to tell you that some of the individuals, that some of the ancestors that were buried here were some of the famous names that we might know historically. That would be not true. We really don't know their names. We know they were Lenape, that they lived in the area. They come from a variety of centuries. That's based upon the funerary objects that came with them. But I think that there's a lot. It's important that we recognize, to Jeremy's point, there's 20,000 years of indigenous occupation here of the Lenape ancestors before a series of forced removals. And sadly, they were propagated by Penn's sons, one of the most egregious ones that starts them on an odyssey that will be ultimately the 8 forced removals that will land them in their current locations. And to be able to bring ancestors back to the homeland was important. And Jeremy talked about it being a healing moment for the tribes. So maybe, Jeremy, you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult at times to even still talk about, but the idea of that we were able to bring our 5 communities that had not been together in at least, we say at least represents at least 50 years of our 5 communities to be together, but in this manner, it's probably been closer to 150 or so years of being together. And so for us to have a gathering point there at Pennsbury Manor to do this work was a chance for us to reconnect socially, politically, even though that's kind of the least of our worries at the time, but politically still, in connecting our leaderships, and culturally. So that was that's what we talk about healing it. The Pennsbury. We wouldn't have ever thought that would be the place that we were able to make those connections again, So, and then, that was, we were able to do that in a way that was meaningful, and also helped to build relationships with the larger community there, and whether that was with the Pennsbury community and outside there, that was what we're trying to do. And we're still in that process of doing that, trying to maintain those connections with the large community and say, hey, we are invested here, and we want our history and education to be known as, we want to educate about our history as well, and to understand that we still have stake, because our beliefs and our cultural practices today are carried all the way back to the things we had there in the area. So I hope that it kind of helps clarify a little bit, Doug.
So, Gene, I saw your question about the ancestors. The ancestors, many of them were disinterred from their original place of rest, where they were buried by tribal members in New Jersey. But there's approximately 180 who are at rest here now. Many of them came from archaeological sites in New Jersey, but the burial here was about 180 ancestors. we'd be happy to take more questions or share more.
Jeremy, I know that the efforts to maintain your language and to maintain your ceremonial practices, your cultural beliefs, that has been something that the tribe has worked for a long time on. And one of the things that I felt, as Doug said, it was such an emotional day to spend with the tribal members that were able to make the journey, and to talk with them and hear what they're doing today. And I think that that's one of the messages that we're not talking about today is how alive your tribe is, your groups are. I got to meet young girls that were 7 or 8 years old that had made the journey, and there were some of the teen boys that had made the journey, and how they're learning about their ancestors, their cultural beliefs, how you're passing that information to them, and helping them to understand and make that connection, if you will, back to the homelands here. And if you would talk a little bit about that, I think that our group here would really appreciate that part of your story.
Yeah, that is something that we try to highlight, and I'm glad you brought that up, that we're not extinct, just because we are not in the area, that we are still living and thriving, and even though we keep talking about reclamation and revitalization, those are some of the finer points, because we still carry on many of our traditional ways. A lot of times it was more because of, honestly, because of the until the 1978 with the Freedom of Religion Act, we weren't able to do things publicly. So a lot of the things that were traditionally and culturally usually practiced communally had to go to families. So we still have families that are really practicing traditional and cultural beliefs. And a lot of the times whenever we talk about those things and we see whether it's our regalia or our beadwork, which it represents parts of our homeland, Lenape, that we're unfamiliar with. One of the things I did point out was that whenever we are able to return to Lenape, their connection, things start to make sense with some of the things we carry on. For example, just as something as small as having the beadwork on the toe of a moccasin represent a leaf, but the leaf wasn't real familiar. Some of us, even up until the time that I was able to return for the first time, which was about 3 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago. It didn't make sense until I saw the leaves on the ground and went, oh, that was a sassafras leaf and not a badly drawn oak leaf from we're familiar with in Oklahoma, understanding that was, that one sassafras. Those small connections then tend to make the most impact. And when we can connect our community, who a number of which have never been in the homelands, to that, I dare say that there are connections that we can't even explain. There's just certain ideas and feelings that you see, and the stories that you're told start to make sense. The histories that are passed down orally start to make sense. Whether it's our traditional stories of whenever squirrels were giants, those tend to make sense more. So I think that those types of things are very important to carry on, and we try to pass those things on to our youth. And we actually have many initiatives now as for opportunities for our youth we're really kind of relying a lot on our youth to carry these on. We have to. We're focusing on our youth to return to the Delaware Water Gap area as well. Developing those programs, we're trying to get ways that in my cultural education department, we're trying to develop ways to get our folks back to help educate, present who we are today and some of our culture and traditions to the general public. I know that we have programming going on at Pennsbury later this in the spring, early May, I believe, and then we're also returning to New Jersey as well, in late May or April, excuse me, and we're bringing folks with us. And not only to experience that and to make those connections for themselves and to carry those on for their children in our community, but they're also sharing with the outside community that we are still here, we are still practicing, we are speaking our language, we are doing our dances, we are performing our ceremonies and things. And so it also helps us when we are able to make those connections and be able to bring folks back to not only connect to the community and benefit both the general community in the areas, but it helps our folks in our community come back and be excited once again about Lenape culture, because you're talking about a history of basically 400 years of forced assimilation. Some of the excitement or the ideas, the responsibility that some of us have aren't quite passed on. And being in Oklahoma, we're in a unique situation also because we have a lot of our tribal citizens who are multiple tribal nations. Because we have 39 tribal nations in Oklahoma, and so whenever they may have Shawnee, they may have Osage, they may have one of many others there. And so getting them excited again about what it means to be Lenape and to carry on that tradition, what it means to carry on those traditions, how we are uniquely Lenape, that is also tied in to what we're doing in our efforts with our ancestors, with places like Pennsbury Manor, with the institutions and museums. So it's all tied into a larger picture of continuing our unique Lenape heritage and ways.
It's a blatant commercial plug, but Jeremy will be back and giving us a public program at Pennsbury Manor Sunday afternoon, May the 7th. And we would love to have any and all of you come and meet him in person and learn from him about, the first people who were here, and getting to know Jeremy and having the opportunity to work with the 5 descendant tribes. There was one tribal elder who was here, was a rancher, wearing a black Stetson. There was a father and son who were lumberjacks with the Stockbridge Muncie. The 13-year-old son thought he hit the jackpot when I gave him the keys to the golf cart so he could run errands for us and so on. But to watch the engagement of these 5 descendant communities working together was just wonderful. And Jeremy's work to re-engage, to keep the culture going and alive. And, he's talked about it, but all of us here in Pennsylvania have seen the articles in the Philly Inquirer or in the newspaper about repatriation efforts at the Carlisle Indian School. I know he has a family member that descended or attended one of the Indian schools. There's a whole lot of history and culture that we assume we know that we don't. And to have the opportunity to hear it from a tribal member is a great privilege. And, Jeremy, I want to thank you for coming and sharing what is really not a Pennsbury story, but it's a Delaware story. And sharing your time and being so gracious with us. Do we have any last questions? Because I do want to be conscious of the time. If not, Rusty, can I pass it back to you with one last commercial plug? Jeremy did a presentation for Pennsylvania Humanities, and that will be going live tomorrow. So if you subscribe to anything from the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, his webcast will be available.
That's awesome. Good news. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was a nice crowd for one of our programs, and I appreciate your spending a little bit of time with us here today to hear from Doug and Jeremy and Janet. I would be not doing my job if I didn't shamelessly plug our statewide museum conference coming up. We're going to be in Hershey, April 23rd to 25th. Registration should open soon. And I guarantee if you saw something about this webinar in your inbox, you will see something about our conference in your inbox soon. I hope to see some of you in person. I think we've been doing virtual programs for 3 years now, and we're about ready to actually sit across from each other at a table. But Jeremy and Janet and Doug, I'd like to thank you once again. And I hope everybody has a great day. If you want to follow up with me about this program, my email address is rusty.baker@pamuseums.org. We'd always like to hear from you. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.